The stadium was alive with murmurs that swelled like waves against the shore as more people crowded into the seats under the glaring lights. No one knew much about the woman who had signed her name only hours before the event began, but her appearance was impossible to ignore. Her arms bore scars deep and jagged, as if carved by battles long forgotten. Her eyes were sharp and unyielding. Her movements slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. The audience leaned forward in curiosity, whispering to each other about whether she truly belonged on that field, and why she had chosen this moment to appear when her name was announced. A hush swept over the crowd, as though even the air itself waited for her next step. She walked forward in silence, her boots striking the track with a steady rhythm that echoed louder than the music playing overhead. Her expression revealed nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin line and her scarred cheek catching the light. Each step told of a life lived through fire and pain, a life that had left her both broken and rebuilt into something unrecognizable. The whispers grew more intense now. Some spectators claimed to have seen her name in old reports about conflicts far away. Others swore she was the survivor of an explosion that no one should have walked away from. Each rumor spread like wildfire among the onlookers, but none could be confirmed. Her presence itself was proof of a story too heavy to tell, and the tension in the air built with each heartbeat on the field. The javelins lay gleaming in the light, slender weapons designed for sport, but somehow looking more like relics of war. Under her gaze, the woman halted before one and bent down, her fingers hovering just above the shaft, as though she were recalling a memory no one else could see. The announcer called out her number again, his voice trembling slightly, betraying the uncertainty that had infected everyone watching. The crowd held its breath. The children pulled closer to their parents, and the athletes, standing nearby, shifted uneasily, for they too could feel the strange current building around her as she reached for the weapon. The instant her hand touched the javelin, a chill ran across the audience, as though the stadium itself had frozen for a second. Her grip was not that of an amateur. Her palm closed around it with familiarity and precision, like someone holding not a piece of sports equipment, but a trusted tool for survival. Veins rose across her scarred arm, her muscles flexing in ways that spoke of strength forged in trials no one could fathom. She lifted the javelin slowly, the polished steel reflecting against her scarred face. The murmurs stopped altogether, replaced by a silence so deep that the sound of her breath seemed like thunder across the field, yet her expression remained unreadable, cold and distant, as though her mind was somewhere far beyond this stadium. She took one step back and then another, her body aligning with a precision that startled the coaches who watched her posture. It was not the stance of an athlete preparing for a game. It was the stance of a fighter prepared for war. The coaches exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to one another about how her form was flawless, yet unlike any style they had taught their students. The athletes beside her could no longer hide their unease. They felt it in their bones that this woman carried with her something greater than strength, something that blurred the line between human endurance and something far more unexplainable. Her eyes scanned the horizon, not the marked target, not the measuring lines, but the farthest point of the field, as though she sought an enemy unseen, as though she measured distance, not for competition, but for survival. Those who sat close enough swore they could see her lips move slightly, as if whispering to herself. Words meant for no one else. Perhaps a memory or a promise or a command left over from a time when silence could mean life or death. Air grew heavier, pressing on the chests of everyone watching until the tension was unbearable. Her body tensed, every scar on her skin seemed to tighten with it, and the crowd waited helplessly, unable to predict what she would do next. The announcer, finally spoke, his voice cracking over the microphone, calling for her attempt to begin, but she did not move. She stood frozen, gripping the javelin as though weighing something far greater than the metal in her hands. Her chest rose slowly, her eyes narrowing in concentration. The crowd shifted nervously, waiting for her to release that stored power. Some even whispered that she might never throw at all, that perhaps she had come here only to prove something invisible to the rest of them. Yet, in that moment, she bent her knees and adjusted her grip, and everyone knew the silence would not last much longer. Her foot slid against the ground. Her muscles coiled like a spring, and the crowd leaned forward, every pair of eyes locked on her movements. But she did not throw. Instead, she froze again, her gaze fixed on something beyond the horizon, something none of them could see. She breathed slowly, her knuckles white around the shaft of the weapon, as though she were holding back a storm ready to break free, and in that suspended second, the air thickened even more until the entire stadium seemed to hang on the edge of collapse, waiting desperate to witness what she would do. The whispers in the stands grew restless as she tightened her grip around the javelin. No one could explain the weight of the moment, yet everyone felt it as though the stadium itself had become a stage for something beyond sport. The other athletes shifted uneasily, some trying to shake off the tension while others stared in awe, unable to look away. Coaches spoke in hurried tones, exchanging guesses about her past, but none dared to voice their theories too loudly. Children clung to their parents, asking who she was, but no answer satisfied them because no one really knew, and the air itself grew heavier, as though bracing for what came next. Rumors flew quickly from one section of the crowd to another. Some claimed she had once been seen in uniform carrying wounded men across fields of fire. Others whispered that she was the lone survivor of a convoy ambush far away in deserts where survival seemed impossible. A few swore she had once lifted a fallen beam in the wreckage of a collapsing building to free those trapped beneath. And though no one could prove any of it, the sight of her scars and her unshakable stance lent truth to every impossible story. The crowd grew hungrier for answers, their eyes locked on her scarred frame, waiting for proof that she was more than just rumor. The officials called for silence once more, their voices strained with authority, yet failing to command the crowd. The woman did not flinch. She adjusted her footing, the spikes of her shoes biting into the track, her body lowering into perfect alignment. Her scars shifting across her arms like maps of battles never told. She breathed in slowly, her chest rising with control, and her eyes narrowing as though focusing on something only she could see. Then, with deliberate calm, she lifted the javelin above her head, and for a heartbeat, the world itself seemed to stop. The crowd exhaled in shock as the weapon hovered with ease above her, her arms steady, her grip unyielding. There was no sign of struggle, no hint of strain, and it was as if the javelin was no heavier than a feather in her scarred hand. She held it aloft, and the air crackled with tension, as though her body channeled something unnatural. Spectators whispered frantically. Was she hiding some kind of secret training? Had she been part of experiments meant to push human limits, or was her power something born only from survival and pain? No one could know, but her silence was an answer in itself. She had no need for explanations. She had only action, and the crowd leaned forward, desperate to see what action she would take. Her gaze shifted across the field, but she did not look at the designated lines or the official markers. She looked further past them into the empty stretch beyond, as if she measured not distance, but possibility, as if she sought a target invisible to all others. Her scars glistened under the harsh light, and her lips parted just slightly, as if recalling words once spoken on a battlefield. The crowd could sense her hesitation, but it was not weakness. It was calculation. She was deciding something, weighing options none of them could understand, and in that indecision lay a tension that made the entire arena tremble with anticipation. Then she moved, the motion, sudden and fluid, like a memory reborn her. Arms swung forward, the javelin cutting through the air with speed that silenced every sound in the stadium. The whoosh was sharp like steel splitting the sky. The weapon became a streak of light racing faster than anyone expected. It traveled beyond the furthest boundary the officials had marked, soaring past the reach of their tools and their expectations before slamming into the earth with a force that sent vibrations crawling beneath the stands. The crowd erupted, but their voices wavered. Between awe and disbelief, no one could accept what they had just seen. Yet no one could deny it either. The ground itself seemed to resist giving up the weapon, the javelin embedded so deep it looked fused into the soil. Officials ran toward it, fumbling with their equipment. But it was clear no normal measurement could capture what had just taken place. The other athletes stood frozen, their own javelins forgotten in their hands, as they stared at the woman who now stood motionless, her arms still, extended her breathing. Calm, her eyes unreadable, she had thrown as though she had not merely cast a spear in sport, but launched a missile meant to pierce through time itself. People shouted numbers, distances, guesses, but none of them made sense, because the throw was beyond any record, beyond any calculation. Some called it impossible, others insisted it had to be real because they had witnessed it with their own eyes. A few in the crowd muttered that it was no longer a competition, but a revelation that this woman was not bound by the same rules as the rest of them, and the murmurs turned into a rising tide of speculation. Who was she? What had forged her strength? What force moved through her veins to allow such a feat? Yet she did not smile. She did not celebrate. Her face remained a mask of silence, her scars twitching faintly as if reminding her of something she wished to forget. She turned her gaze back toward the field, and for the first time her eyes softened, not with pride, but with memory. A shadow passed across her features, one that hinted at loss and pain, deeper than any wound on her skin. The crowd saw it too, though none understood. And that glimpse of vulnerability only deepened the mystery she carried because it suggested there was more to her than power. There was a story of suffering etched into every scar. The officials tried to approach her, speaking hurriedly about rules, measurements, and legitimacy, but she barely looked at them. She stepped back, her body language guarded as though preparing to leave at any moment. One official dared to reach out his hand toward her arm. But the instant he did, she shifted. Her stance a reflex so sharp and precise it made the man recoil. Her reaction was not violent, but it carried the weight of discipline and training honed for survival. The officials hesitated, caught between fear and duty, and in that hesitation, the woman turned away, her silence louder than any defiance. The crowd erupted again, but their voices were no longer those of simple spectators. They demanded answers. They wanted to know who she was, why she had come, and why she had hidden in shadows. Until now, journalists scrambled with cameras. Athletes whispered to each other about what this meant for them, and parents held their children tighter as though they had just witnessed the awakening of something dangerous yet awe-inspiring. The woman did not respond to any of it. She simply stood there, her body unmoving. Her gaze locked on the horizon as though she still saw something they did not, and the silence returned heavier than before. A storm of questions spread across the stadium, but none reached her. She stood apart like a statue carved from war itself. Her scars gleaming under the lights, her muscles unyielding, her face unreadable, and the javelin buried far beyond the reach of human effort still trembled in the ground. As though unwilling to release the energy she had unleashed, the audience knew instinctively this was not the end of her story. This was only the beginning, and though the stadium roared with voices, the only sound that truly mattered was the silence of the war-scarred woman who had thrown farther than anyone thought possible, yet had chosen not to explain. And in that silence, every soul in the arena leaned forward, hearts pounding with the same unspoken thought. What would she do next? The moment. after the javelin struck the ground, carried a silence so sharp it pierced through the stadium, the earth itself seemed unwilling to let go of the weapon. Its shaft buried deeper than any throw had ever gone. The officials hesitated in their attempts to pull it free, their hands trembling as they tugged at the stubborn spear, and the audience leaned forward, restless with disbelief. The woman stood unmoving, her expression hard as though she had expected this outcome, and her scars caught the light. Once more her body framed like a statue of defiance, her presence impossible to ignore, and the crowd knew instinctively that they were only beginning to see the extent of her strength. Spectators muttered in frantic tones, their words rising and colliding like sparks from dry wood. Some said she was not human, that perhaps she had been altered by forces beyond nature. Others whispered that she had lived through horrors so cruel that her body had adapted and become something more resilient than any ordinary being. The children in the front rows looked at her with fear and fascination, while their parents exchanged glances, unsure whether to shield their young eyes or let them watch history being carved before them. The energy in the arena grew restless because this was no longer about competition. It was about discovering who she really was and what had shaped her into this figure of unyielding power. The woman finally lowered her arm, her movements controlled and precise. She walked forward, her boots pressing into the track with a weight that reverberated through the silence. Every step commanded attention, and yet her face betrayed nothing. Her gaze remained locked on the javelin embedded in the earth as though it called. Her back to memories no one else could share when she reached it. The officials backed away, uncertain whether to assist or to retreat. Her hands hovered over the shaft, her fingers trembling just slightly, as though she debated whether to pull it free and reveal even more of her strength. The tension rose higher, the crowd silent once again, waiting to see if she would do what no one else could. She wrapped her scarred hands around the weapon and pulled the ground, resisted, clinging to the steel as though it too feared releasing it, but her muscles surged, veins tightening across her arms as she lifted with a force that sent shudders through the soil. Slowly the weapon rose from its earthen prison, freed by a strength so unnatural that the officials stumbled back, and the audience gasped once more. She held the javelin aloft, its surface streaked with dirt, its weight nothing more than a feather in her grasp, and her eyes hardened as if she had been reminded of battles fought, not in arenas but in places far darker and crueler than this. The announcer stammered through the microphone, attempting to control the situation, his voice faltering as he tried to declare her throw invalid or at least immeasurable, but his words carried no weight against what everyone had just witnessed. The crowd ignored him, their voices rising again, shouting questions, demands, pleas for her to speak. But the woman remained silent, her eyes unfocused, as though she no longer stood in the stadium but in the ashes of a past only. She remembered. She turned the weapon slowly in her hand, her scars twisting across her skin like maps of survival, and for a brief moment her lips parted as though she might speak. Yet she said nothing, and the silence returned sharper than before. The other athletes tried to muster their courage, but none could move forward. Their javelins felt heavier than before, their hands weak, their confidence shattered by what they had seen. Some looked away, ashamed, while others glared at her with envy or fear. But none could deny that they had witnessed something that shattered the meaning of competition. The woman had not only thrown further than records allowed, she had broken the illusion that this was merely sport. She had reminded them all that strength could be forged in places far beyond training grounds and measured fields, strength forged in fire and blood. The officials huddled together, debating frantically about what to do. Some argued she should be disqualified. Others insisted she must be tested and observed, for she represented something more than an athlete. Their words clashed, but none dared approach her again. She stood apart, holding the weapon with ease, her scars glistening with sweat, her body carved by struggle, and every second she remained silent, the mystery grew heavier. Her presence no longer that of a competitor, but of a force that none could control or contain. The crowd shifted uneasily, sensing that they were standing at the edge of something larger than a game, something that might not be safe to uncover. She turned away from the officials, her boots striking the ground as she walked slowly back across the field. Each step deliberate, her shoulders broad, her grip still firm around the javelin. The cameras followed her every move, capturing the image of a scarred warrior rather than a mere athlete. Her shadow stretched long across the track under the stadium lights, and people whispered that she carried with her not just strength, but stories etched into her flesh. Stories too heavy to tell. Yet impossible to ignore, her silence became a roar in itself, echoing louder than the cheers or the gasps, and leaving everyone aching for the truth she would not speak as. She reached the edge of the field. She paused, her head lifting slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. The crowd grew quiet once again, trying to decipher her stillness. Her eyes narrowed, scanning the distance as though expecting a threat. Her body tensed, her grip on the javelin tightening. She looked less like a victor leaving the stage and more like a sentinel standing guard over something unseen. The officials hesitated, afraid to intervene. The other athletes stood frozen, and the crowd sat waiting, their hearts racing with the same unspoken question. What had she come here for, and what would she reveal next? The silence dragged on, stretching each second into eternity, before she finally lowered the weapon and took another step forward, yet her shoulders remained tense and her eyes wary, as though she had decided something within herself that none of them could comprehend. She walked toward the tunnel leading out of the arena, her figure casting a long shadow behind her. The crowd called out, begging for answers, begging for her name, begging for her story. But she offered nothing. She vanished slowly into the darkness of the tunnel, leaving behind only the echo of her presence and the javelin, throw that would haunt their memories forever. The officials scrambled to control the chaos, but their words were drowned out by the restless audience. The journalists pushed closer, shouting into their cameras about what they had just seen, speculating wildly about her origins and her strength. Some declared she was proof of untapped human potential. Others whispered of government projects and hidden wars. No one agreed on anything. Except for one undeniable truth: they had witnessed something that defied explanation, something that blurred the line between human and myth. And though she had walked away, her silence lingered heavier than any speech. Her scars spoke louder than any victory. Her strength was undeniable. Yet her story remained hidden, and that mystery held the crowd in its grip, refusing to release them. The world had just seen a glimpse of something it could not understand, and it knew deep down that the war-scarred woman would not vanish so easily. Her path was only beginning, and the shadow she left behind promised that the next time she appeared, it would shake them even more. And with that thought, the crowd sat restless, their hearts thundering with anticipation, because every soul in the stadium knew she would return, and when she did, they could only wonder what greater power she would unleash next. The tunnel swallowed her figure, but the noise of the crowd did not fade. It followed her like an unrelenting tide, echoing through the walls as journalists rushed to find her and officials debated whether to chase or to let her go. She walked steadily, her boots striking the floor with the same deliberate rhythm as before, her scars catching faint flickers of light from the lamps overhead, her breath slow, her face unreadable. Every step she took deepened the mystery around her, and those who caught a glimpse whispered of shadows stretching long behind her as though they too belonged to the past she carried. Security guards moved nervously at the entrance, unsure whether to stop her or to clear a path. Their hands hovered near their radios, but their eyes betrayed uncertainty. None of them wanted to be the one to confront her silence had a weight sharper than any command. She passed them without hesitation, her posture tall and unyielding, and they stepped aside, compelled by something they could not name. Some tried to follow, but her pace quickened, her presence slipping through the dim passage until she was little more than a phantom disappearing deeper into the unknown, and each man left behind felt the sting of questions they dared not voice. Outside the tunnel, the chaos grew unchecked. The crowd demanded answers, their voices a storm of speculation. The officials struggled to contain the fury as camera lights flashed and reporters spoke into microphones, spinning tales of a war-scarred woman who had shattered the boundaries of sport. Some claimed she would be investigated. Others insisted she had to be celebrated. But all agreed the world would never forget her face, her scars, or the power she had shown. Yet behind all the noise, a single truth grew clearer. She had walked away without taking glory, without accepting recognition, and that silence was more haunting than any declaration she might have given. She emerged from the back exit of the stadium into the night air, the sky heavy with clouds and the wind sharp against her skin. The silence outside was a stark contrast to the roar within, but she welcomed it. She stood still for a moment, her hand tightening around the javelin she still carried, though it should have been returned. Her eyes scanned the dark horizon as if searching for something. Unseen, her scars glistened under the pale light of a distant street lamp, her chest rising with steady breaths as though preparing for another battle, far from the cheers and questions of the crowd, and her gaze hardened with a resolve that none could interpret. A small group of reporters spotted her and hurried across the lot, their cameras bouncing, their voices calling out questions about her past, her scars, her impossible throw. They begged for her name, her story, her secrets, but she did not respond. She walked forward, her boots steady, her silence louder than their shouts. They surrounded her desperate, yet none dared to touch her, the aura around her too heavy to cross. One reporter finally asked if she had been part of secret experiments, if her strength was born of war or science. Her eyes flicked toward him only for a second, and the look was enough to silence the group. They stepped back, shaken by a presence they could not define. She reached the far edge of the lot, where an old truck waited, its paint chipped, its frame sturdy. She placed the javelin in the bed of the truck and climbed inside, her movements efficient, her face hidden in shadow. The reporters fumbled with their cameras, but the truck roared to life, drowning out their voices. She drove away without a word, the tail lights shrinking until the night consumed them, leaving only the echo of her departure and the silence of unanswered questions that weighed heavier than the stadium roar had minutes before. Inside the stadium, the debate raged hotter. Officials shouted at each other about disqualification, about rewriting rules, about whether to erase her attempt from the record or enshrine it forever. Coaches argued with reporters, athletes whispered in confusion, and fear the crowd refused to leave, demanding clarity, as though they could not accept being left in the dark. Their obsession grew because what they had seen was not merely sport, it was revelation. Yet revelation without explanation only deepened the hunger for answers, and in that hunger, the woman herself became legend before the night had even ended. Meanwhile, she drove alone down an empty road, the headlights carving paths through the darkness, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes fixed. On the horizon, the wind rattled through the cracked windows, carrying faint echoes of the crowd she had left behind, but she did not look back. Her mind far away, wandering through memories etched deeper than any scar she bore, flashes of fire and smoke, of cries in languages long forgotten, of broken ground and broken bodies, and the relentless weight of survival. Every image seared into her soul and guiding every step she took in the present. Yet her expression did not waver. She remained calm even as the ghosts of her past whispered around her. The truck rattled over a bridge, the sound of water below rising faintly against the night air. She slowed for a moment, her gaze shifting to the river beneath its dark surface, reflecting the thin glow of the moon. Her scars burned faintly as if alive, reminding her of moments where water had once carried away fire and blood. She gripped the wheel tighter, the memories pressing hard, yet she forced her breath steady. She drove on into the night. The silence around her deepening once more, as though the world itself knew better than to disturb her. Path hours later, the truck rolled to a stop at the edge of a forest. Its trees tall and silent, the kind of place where secrets could vanish, without trace. She stepped out, her boots crunching against the dirt, her body outlined against the moonlight. She lifted the javelin from the bed. Her hand wrapping around it with the same precision as before, she looked at the trees. Her gaze steady, her scars alive with memory. She stepped into the shadows of the forest, her figure fading among the trunks, her presence absorbed by the night, and those who might have followed her, lost their courage, for the forest seemed to swallow not only her figure but her story as well. Back in the city, the news spread faster than wildfire. Screens lit up with images of her impossible, through her scarred face frozen in silence. Her shadow cast long against the stadium lights. Commentators debated furiously. Experts argued about biomechanics. Military historians speculated about secret training programs. Conspiracy theorists shouted about hidden powers, while survivors of wars quietly whispered that they recognized the look in her eyes, the look of someone who had seen too much and carried too much, yet stood unbroken. Her silence became the center of endless speculation, but none could reach her. None could follow her into the shadows she had chosen. The legend grew in her absence, every voice trying to claim her story, every report trying to define her, but all failing because she had offered nothing, no words, no explanations, no answers, only action and silence and scars. The world demanded more, but received nothing, and in that void she became larger than life. A figure both feared and revered. Her story unfinished, her path unknown, her presence like a storm cloud waiting beyond the horizon. And in the quiet of the forest, she stood still, the javelin planted into the ground before her hand resting lightly on its shaft, her eyes closed, her breath steady, her scars burning faintly in the moonlight. She did not need the crowd. She did not need recognition. She had come only to remind herself of something she had once forgotten. Something only she could understand. And as the wind whispered through the trees, she opened her eyes again, her gaze sharp and unyielding. Her story not ended, but only paused her strength. Not spent, but waiting. And the night itself seemed to hold its breath, because somewhere beyond that silence lay the certainty that she would return, and when she did, the world would tremble again, wondering what more the war-scarred woman would reveal.